Picture a gun crew crouched in the red dust of southern Angola in the last weeks of 1975. Shells are falling on their position. They cannot see the guns firing them. Worse than that, they cannot reach them. The cannon in front of these men has been in service for over 30 years. It fired at El Alamein, it fired at Tobruk, it helped push Rommel out of North Africa. And right now, in the Angolan bush, it cannot throw a shell far enough to hit back. Within 5 years, this single moment of humiliation would push one of the most isolated governments on earth to build an artillery piece that could outrange NATO's best guns. And the man who made it possible would end up doing time in an American federal prison. And then, a decade later, dead on a doorstep in Brussels with 3 bullets in the back of his skull. The case was never solved. This is the story of how a battlefield failure with a leftover World War II gun sparked one of the strangest, most illegal arms deals of the Cold War. To understand how badly things had slipped by 1975, you have to understand what South Africa's army was actually carrying into battle. The mainstay of their artillery was the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, a British gun howitzer that had been the backbone of Commonwealth forces since 1940. It was rugged, reliable, and by every account a fine weapon in its day. Its day, though, had been 35 years earlier. South Africa had inherited enormous stocks of British military hardware after the war, and like a lot of Commonwealth nations, it simply kept using what it had. Guns don't wear out from age the way people assume. A well-maintained gun barrel can fire for decades, but doctrine moves on, and range moves on, and by the 1970s the 25-pounder's maximum range of around 12 kilometers was no longer a modern number. It was a 1940 number, still sitting on the front line in 1975. South Africa's isolation made this worse than it would have been for almost any other country. Since 1963, the United Nations had a voluntary arms embargo against Pretoria over apartheid. It would become mandatory in 1977. That meant South Africa couldn't simply walk into an American or European arms fair and buy the newest 155mm howitzer off the shelf. Every gun in South Africa's arsenal by the mid-1970s was either homegrown, decades old, or smuggled in through back channels. And in October 1975, that arsenal was about to be tested in a war nobody at home had been told was happening. Operation Savannah was South Africa's covert military intervention in the Angolan Civil War, sending armored columns deep into Angola to back anti-Marxist factions against the Soviet and Cuban-backed MPLA. On paper, the South African force looked formidable. Armored cars, paratroopers, artillery batteries pushing hundreds of kilometers north. In practice, they ran straight into Soviet-supplied D-30 122mm howitzers operated by Cuban gunners, guns with a reach nearly double that of the 25-pounder. South African batteries found themselves able to see enemy muzzle flashes on the horizon and unable to do a single thing about it. Radio traffic from the period describes crews watching incoming rounds land inside their own perimeter, while their return fire fell short by kilometers. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is another to lose it because your gun simply cannot reach the enemy at all. Operation Savannah wound down in early 1976, and South Africa withdrew from Angola in humiliating fashion, its intervention exposed to a hostile international press and roundly condemned. But inside the Ministry of Defence in Pretoria, a much quieter reckoning was underway. Somebody had to answer a very uncomfortable question. With the world refusing to sell South Africa modern weapons, and South Africa refusing to give up its nuclear-armed, artillery-heavy military posture, how exactly was the country supposed to build a gun that could outrange the Soviet Union's export hardware, completely on its own? The answer to that question came from a man nobody in Pretoria had ever met, working out of a farmhouse on the Vermont-Quebec border, a man who was, at that exact moment, one of the most gifted and most reckless ballistics engineers alive. His name was Gerald Bull. Bull was a Canadian prodigy, the youngest person ever to earn a PhD in aeronautical engineering from the University of Toronto, still in his 20s when he was doing supersonic ballistics work for the Canadian government. In the 1960s, he had been the driving force behind Project HARP, the High Altitude Research Project, a joint US-Canadian effort that used a modified naval gun, 16 inches of barrel, 16 stories long when assembled, to literally fire scientific payloads to the edge of space using conventional artillery. Gerald Bull did not want to build better guns. He wanted to build the best gun that had ever existed, and he did not much care whose war it ended up fighting. When government funding for HARP dried up in 1967, Bull didn't stop. He founded the Space Research Corporation, deliberately straddling the US-Canada border so that the company itself technically existed in two countries at once, a detail that would matter enormously later when investigators tried to figure out exactly which country's laws he'd broken. At SRC, Bull perfected two innovations that quietly changed artillery forever: extended-range full-bore ammunition, shells engineered with a slightly smaller diameter and a more aerodynamic profile to slip through the barrel with less friction and fly farther, and base bleed technology, a small pyrotechnic charge in the base of the shell that burns during flight to reduce the drag-inducing vacuum that normally forms behind a projectile. Combined, these two ideas alone could add 10, 15, even 20 kilometers of extra range to an existing gun design without touching the barrel at all. This was exactly what a desperate, embargoed, humiliated South African military needed. And in 1976, in the immediate aftermath of Angola, Armscor, the state-owned armaments corporation of South Africa, itself created specifically to dodge the arms embargo, began making very quiet contact with Gerald Bull. What happened over the next 4 years is where this story stops being a footnote in artillery history and starts being a genuine international scandal. Officially, the United States and Canada both banned the sale of arms and military technology to South Africa. Unofficially, Gerald Bull's Space Research Corporation became one of the single biggest technology pipelines the apartheid government ever had. Bull didn't sell South Africa finished guns. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace at the border. Instead, SRC shipped South Africa complete artillery barrels labeled as commercial goods, technical blueprints disguised as academic research, and, in one especially brazen episode, thousands of tons of ERFB ammunition components routed through Antigua, a tiny Caribbean island with no meaningful military of its own, using forged end-user certificates that claimed the shipment's final destination was the Antiguan government. It never went anywhere near Antigua. From the Caribbean, everything was quietly redirected onto ships bound for South African ports. Antiguan officials later insisted they had no idea what they'd signed off on. Whether that was true or convenient is still debated. Using Bull's ERFB and base bleed technology, plus barrel designs adapted from his 155mm gun howitzer work, Armscor engineers built a new weapon from the ground up, the G5. It fired a standard round out to roughly 30 kilometers, already matching or beating most NATO 155mm howitzers of the era. With Bull's base bleed rounds, it could reach nearly 40 kilometers. For comparison, the American M198 howitzer, one of NATO's frontline 155mm guns at the time, topped out at around 30 kilometers, even with its best ammunition. A country that couldn't legally buy a single artillery shell on the open market had just built a gun that could outrange the guns of the entire Western Alliance. But before the G5 ever fired a shot at an enemy, its creator was already in serious trouble. In 1980, US federal investigators finally caught up with the paper trail running through Antigua, and Gerald Bull was arrested and charged in a US district court with illegally exporting arms technology to South Africa. Facing the case, Bull pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 6 months at the Allenwood Federal Prison Camp in Pennsylvania, a minimum security facility sometimes nicknamed, only half-jokingly, Club Fed. Bull would later describe it as the great betrayal of his life. The country he'd worked for on rockets and space guns had put him behind bars for building better artillery for someone else. He walked out of Allenwood in 1981 angrier, more radicalized against the Western governments he felt had discarded him, and completely unrepentant about who he'd sell to next. The G5 entered full service with the South African Defence Force in 1982, and it did not stay a secret for long. In the mid to late 1980s, the border war in Angola and Namibia flared back up, and this time, South African gunners had the gun their predecessors had needed a decade earlier. At the brutal, prolonged battles around Cuito-Cuanavale in 1987 and 1988, often described as the largest land battle in Africa since World War II, G5 batteries reportedly outranged the Soviet and Cuban artillery on the other side of the line, the very same class of gun that had humiliated South Africa's 25-pounders 12 years before. The weapon, built from a smuggled Canadian design, funded by a pariah government, engineered by a convicted arms trafficker, had turned the tables completely. And that isn't even the strangest part of Gerald Bull's story. Locked out of Western defense contracts by his own conviction, Bull spent the 1980s selling his artillery expertise to whoever would still take his calls, including, disastrously for him, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. He helped Iraq develop the GC-45 Howitzer, a close cousin of South Africa's G5 born from the exact same technology, and then took on a project so ambitious it bordered on fantasy. Project Babylon, a plan to build Iraq a supergun with a barrel over 150 meters long, theoretically capable of firing satellites into orbit, or, depending on who you asked, chemical or nuclear payloads over enormous distances. Multiple intelligence services, Bull believed, were watching him closely by then. He was right to be worried. In March 1990, Gerald Bull was shot 5 times outside his Brussels apartment, including at close range to the back of the head, in what investigators immediately recognized as a professional assassination. No one was ever charged. Suspicion has fallen for over 3 decades on Israel's Mossad, on Iraqi intelligence, and on Iran, and the file remains officially unsolved. There are pieces of this story almost nobody outside artillery historians and Cold War intelligence buffs has ever heard. Gerald Bull's original HARP space gun project actually did put a projectile into the edge of space in 1966, decades before private space companies made space guns sound futuristic. The technology simply got shelved when the funding disappeared. The Antiguan end-user certificate scandal became such an embarrassment that it triggered a formal parliamentary inquiry in the Antiguan government, one of the smallest such inquiries in modern history, over a shipment its own officials swore they never truly understood. South Africa itself denied any relationship with Gerald Bull for years after his conviction, even as G5 guns bearing unmistakable traces of his ballistic fingerprint rolled off Armscore's production lines. And the G5's descendant, a self-propelled version called the G6 Rhino, went on to become one of the most successful South African arms exports of the post-apartheid era, sold to multiple foreign militaries who had no idea, or didn't ask, how much of its lineage traced back to a dead man's illegal Antiguan paper trail. The legacy of all this stretches far beyond one battlefield in Angola. Extended-range full-bore ammunition and base-bleed technology, the 2 innovations Gerald Bull refined and then smuggled south, are not niche curiosities today. They are baseline artillery technology used by armies around the world, including, eventually, some of the very NATO nations that banned him from selling it in the first place. The G5 and G6 remain in active service with several countries today, and surviving South African-built examples sit in military museums as one of the clearest illustrations in modern history of how an arms embargo, instead of stopping a determined government, can simply force it to get creative, and how one brilliant, reckless engineer's decision to sell to the highest bidder can end up shaping wars he never lived to see. Somewhere in a museum today sits a gun that only exists because a crew of South African soldiers, holding a 35-year-old British cannon, once watched an enemy shell land inside their own lines and realized they had absolutely no way to answer back. That single moment of helplessness in the Angolan bush in 1975 set off a chain of events running through a Vermont farmhouse, a Pennsylvania prison camp, a rigged shipping manifest out of the Caribbean, and finally a doorstep in Brussels where a story like this one was always going to end, the way stories about arms dealers tend to end. The 25-pounder that started it all is long retired now, quietly rusting in the same kind of collection that holds so many of the forgotten weapons we've covered on this channel, one more piece of World War II hardware whose real story was never the war it was built for, but everything that happened after it. If this one surprised you, that's the whole point of this channel. The true story is almost always stranger and darker than the version everyone thinks they already know. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering these, because next time we're going back to a stretch of ocean where the US Navy deliberately sank its own fleet, and almost nobody alive remembers why.